Mrs. Burton,
Here.
Mrs. Bradford,
Here.
Mr. Centers,
Here.
Mrs. Frank,
Here.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Here.
Mrs. Bonifield is here, and President Johnson.
Here, we do have a
Thank you.
quorum. So we'll move to item 2, which is our public hearing, proposed 2020-2021 budget and millage rates. And at this point, I will turn it over to Mrs. Smith.
Thank you, President Johnson. I will pull up our presentation and hopefully you will see that momentarily. Okay, so first up, I've pulled our proposed millage rates for 2020. As you'll see, our operating millage is the same as it was last year, which is 18 mills on our non-homestead and 6 mills on our commercial property, so the same as last year. For the debt retirement fund, I'm also proposing that we keep the mills levied the same. And then for the sinking fund, there is a change, and that is a result of our sinking fund replacement millage that was approved by the voters in August this past year. I will make note that the voters approved 1.6 mills, and due to the heavily rollback, meaning our property tax value increases, that was subject to a rollback. So the proposed levy for the sinking fund is 1.5934 mills, which I'm anticipating will bring in just about $7.5 million for sinking fund projects. So those are the proposed millage rates. I'll move on to our budget and our proposed assumptions. These are all items that we went over during the study session at the committee meeting, but for anybody that wasn't able to tune into those, I first wanted to review some assumptions that were made for the revenue. First off, that we are anticipating a per pupil cut in funding. We do know that school districts have been impacted by the decrease in sales tax revenue. We're not quite sure how that's going to pan out. We haven't seen an official budget from the state yet, but we are budgeting for a $650 per pupil cut. We assumed no other changes in state funding as we don't have the approved budget from the state. So that means all the different categorical line items have stayed the same. And then as soon as that comes out, we'll bring a budget amendment to the board and update those revenue accordingly. We also assumed a 200 student enrollment loss. We backed out 31A at-risk carryover funds, as those carryover funds will be fully expended this year. In our final amendment going before the board for tonight, I had included a transfer from our health and welfare fund. That's a one-time transfer. So that transfer is coming out of the proposed budget for next year. I've included an additional transfer from the special education fund. I've also included revenue from the sale of property for Old Webster, Wilson, and Adams. Those are things that haven't closed yet. We do have the signed purchase agreements for 2 of the properties, but there's some due diligence periods that the developers have. So, but again, we feel pretty confident that those will be closing in this coming fiscal year, so they have been included in our budget. We've also included revenue that the district is receiving from the CARES Act through the ESSER grant. And then there's also been some various adjustments to the local revenues. On the expenditure side, I've gone through and backed out the one-time expenditures we had in the 2019-20 school year. I've included the purchase of 22 propane buses, which are 60% funded out of our general fund and 40% out of a grant. I've included the state determined employer retirement rate increase. So again, that's something that's outside of the school district's hands. The state determines what the retirement rate will be for the coming year. And so we've included that in our proposed budget. We also know what the hard cap increase will be in January. So I've included that in our budget. I've also included projected savings from staff retirements. I've included the change of expenditures based on our collective bargaining agreements. We'll be in year 2 of a 3-year agreement with each of our employee groups. And then I've also included some targeted budget reductions. So with all this in mind, I will show you what our final budget amendment is. again, which was discussed at our study session and committee meeting, we're anticipating ending the school year with about a 16.2% fund balance. I've gone ahead and adjusted the beginning fund balance for the 2021 budget, assuming that some expenditures will come in better than budgeted. We're anticipating our revenues to be $152.1 million, our expenditures to be $159 million, and to have an ending fund balance of $19.2 million or 12%. And then just a reminder again, we went over these funds during our study session and committee meeting, but as required, we also maintain other funds. The general fund is by and large our largest fund, that's our operating fund, but we also maintain a funded projects fund. So that's where we account for most of the grants that the district receives. We also have a special education fund, and that's where we account for the county Act 18 programs for our special needs students. We also maintain a health and welfare fund. We have the food service fund. We maintain debt retirement funds. So these would be for bonds that have been passed by our community, and now we are paying back those bonds. We have a scholarship fund that does not come from taxpayer dollars. Those are donations that have been made to the district and then are made to our seniors. We also have various capital projects fund. We have a sinking fund, which the last levy for this first sinking fund was in 2019. That'll now expire. And for this 2020 calendar year, we'll now have the first levy of our replacement sinking fund. We also have a technology fund. We have a capital projects fund, which is where sale of property typically goes. And then we also have some funds remaining in our 2013 bond series 2. And then last but not least, our school activities fund. So these are funds that are fundraised or generated by the schools that they largely have control over in the buildings, but that we have the oversight to manage. So with that, I will stop if there's any comments or questions.
Any questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Burton.
Sorry, I had to mess with the mic for a moment there. Certainly, we are not happy about the $650 per student cut, and we are very much advocating against that ultimately happening. However, we've been told by our auditors that if we do not go forward and plan on that at this point, that would be counted against us in our audit, because as of today, that is the best information that we have. We are by no means just accepting that without question and without advocating for proper funding for public education. However, as we discussed at length in our previous board meetings, and just so the public is aware, we are absolutely advocating for appropriate funding. And none of us believe that $650 per student cut is anywhere near appropriate. However, we are obligated to budget based on the best information that we have today, which is unfortunately exactly that. I would like to thank our staff, our community, our administrative team, and our board for making wise decisions for the previous 10 years to take us out of a very dangerous fund balance position into the healthy one that we have today, because the fund balance is there for exactly this purpose, so that when we get hit with unexpected large expenditures to our district or large cuts to our district, we are a strong enough district that we can weather this. We are by no means happy about it, and we're going to be taking cuts all over the board. However, we are doing the best that we can, and I'm thankful to our LPS community for having a fund balance that we have, so that we can begin to get through this predicament that we have found ourselves in financially, statewide and nationwide.
I know one thing I just realized I didn't share tonight, but what that $650 per pupil cut means for our general fund is about $9 million per year. So a $9 million cut in our revenue. And again, we became aware of that at the May 15th revenue estimating conference. So very late in the school year.
And that is not just limited to this year, is it, Mrs. Smith?
That's correct. We don't know how that will be resolved, but we know that the sales revenue or the projected revenue for the 1920 school year is short by about $1.1 billion. And we know if that cut was evenly dispersed across all the school districts, that would be in the range of a $650 to $700 per pupil cut. We're hopeful that there might be some, some federal funding out there or other state revenue that might mean that we wouldn't see that cut in 1920. But right now, we have budgeted for that because that is a very real possibility. And as Ms. Burton said, we've sought the advice from our auditors, and they've told us that that would be the most responsible thing to do is for budget for the cut. It would be better for your revenue to come in better than for it to come in so significantly less than what was budgeted for. So the $650 cut is something that we're budgeting for the 1920 school year, and that we're assuming that will be carried forward to the 2021 school year.
Any other questions or comments from the board, Mrs. Frank?
And again, I think that it just, when we look at this, and I think I think that you said this, Mrs. Smith, but I do think it bears repeating. And again, what Mrs. Burton said, we don't know exactly what it's going to be, but the state has a guideline that we have to approve our budget by July 1st, July 1st. Mm-hmm. And so that's the piece that it is difficult for us, and we are going to have to be nimble. Mrs. Oquist said it best. We're going to have to be nimble as we go. We are hoping that these budget cuts don't happen, but we need to plan for them. And so I think that that's a thing that we are making decisions now with a lot of unknowns. We don't know what things are going to look like in the fall, but we do need to make these decisions because by law, we have to have a budget in place by July 1st, regardless of what the state does. Even though the state doesn't have their budget in place, we still have to have ours in place. So I think that school districts all over are trying to manage and put these numbers in place when there's so many unknowns right now. And I think that it's going to be a testament to our school district and all of our staff and employees that as things come closer, and hopefully we'll get a better picture of what things look like. But for right now, this is the best that we have, because the state has not made any decisions. And even waiting till June 29th to make this decision, we don't know that there's going to be any clearer direction than what has been given to us at this point.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Any other questions or comments from the board? All right, thank you, Mr. Centers.
So we know that it's very likely that we will not see a budget very soon. There's a bill that has bipartisan support to delay the budget this year because of the situation. So I'm going to echo my colleagues. It's very frustrating for us who, we have to make decisions at a local level. I appreciate all the work that Ms. Smith has done. I don't know how many iterations of a budget she's had to do in the last, month or two. But I think, she's planning conservatively in the right way, and I certainly appreciate that. And we'll hope for good news as this proceeds. But thank you for your diligence and your hard work.
Thank you, Mr. Centers. Anyone else at this point? Seeing none, then we will move to item 3 on this agenda, audience communication. And Mrs. Jenkins, I understand there are no audience communications for this meeting. Is that correct?
That is correct, President Johnson. For this public hearing, there are no public comments.
Thank you. Then it'll take us to item 4. There's nothing else on the agenda. We have had the public hearing, so we will adjourn this, and we will be back in just a second to begin our regular meeting.
Okay, President Johnson, you can start.
Mark, can you hear me?
Yes.
My screen has frozen. I have to exit and re-enter. I'll be with you momentarily.
We'll wait just a second.
Thank you.
I had to do the
Keith?
same thing.
Keith, are we live?
Yes. All right, President Johnson, you can begin.
Are you with us, Mrs. Burton?
I am, thank you.
Okay. Good evening again and welcome to our regular meeting of June 15th, 2020. We are just a few minutes late, but again, thank you for tuning in tonight. This is our regular or voting meeting, and we are bringing it to you virtually once again, given the circumstances. So we will start right away with our roll call, and Mrs. Bonifield, would you take the roll, please?
Thank you, President Johnson. Mrs. Burton,
Here.
Mrs. Bradford,
Here.
Mr. Centers,
Here.
Mrs. Frank,
Here.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Here.
Mrs. Bonifield is here, and President Johnson.
Here. We do have a quorum. Mrs. Bonifield, would you lead us in the pledge, please?
I would love to do that. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mrs. Bonifield. Once again, welcome to our regular meeting. For those of you who are following us live and want to follow along with our agenda, you can go to our website, livoniapublicschools.org, highlight over the board tab, and you will see board information on the right. And if you left click on that, you will see a screen pop up on the left that has meeting agendas, and you can click on that and follow along with us tonight. One of the things that we have done regularly, although when we've been doing the virtual meetings, I have not been as cognizant of it, but I want to, particularly with what is going on in our communities, not only here, but across the nation, is to read our district climate goal. And that states that all students will experience a positive, safe, and welcoming environment where both students and adults respect and value one another. In today's climate, it is so important that we not only respect our students and adults in the schools, but in our communities and across the nation. So please keep that in mind with our everyday lives, and just respect and take care of each other. Would you please? So we will move on to item 3, our communications. I do not have any written communications. Are there any that you know of, Mrs. Oquist?
We do not have any response to prior audience communications. I do believe when we get to the audience communication items, we do have an item that Mrs. Jenkins will read aloud, and that will be item B.
And that's where we're going to go right now to item 3B, audience communication. And Mrs. Jenkins.
Thanks, President Johnson. We do have one submitted form for audience communications from Mike Testa, a resident of Livonia. The topic of his communication is school funding resolution. And Mr. Testa writes, I support the passage of the resolution for school funding that you will be voting on tonight. Please also use this as an opportunity to encourage and promote how community members can help in advocating for better funding from Lansing.
Great, thank you, Mrs. Jenkins.
You're welcome.
Are there any others? Is that all we have for audience communication?
That is all we have tonight, yes.
Thank you. That'll move us into item 3C, response to prior audience communication. I do not have any. Are there any other responses to prior audience communication? Seeing none, we'll move on to item 3D, and we'll hear our update from our superintendent, Mrs. Oquist.
Well, thank you so much, President Johnson. We are excited to have our final official board meeting of this school year. And we're going to be doing some talking about this current year and some end of year activities, as well as planning for the year ahead. So I'd like to share the following on behalf of our secondary administration team, who has been hard at work over these past months planning for our class of 2020. The celebrations and recognitions are again front and center this coming week for our class of 2020. Each of our high schools have planned for a decorated car parade to be taking place this Friday, June 19th, allowing an opportunity once again for our graduates to don their cap and gown and deck out their vehicle in school colors and display their pride throughout the city and residential neighborhoods. So information is coming to our students and parents from each school regarding their specific start time and the route for the parade. I'd like to give a thank you to our partners at the Livonia Police Department for assisting us on getting our parade started and headed out safely. And again, speaking of safety, we'll just take this opportunity, as we will throughout these next few days, to remind our students to be especially careful as they celebrate in this neat way, to remain safely inside their vehicles and buckled up and all those things a mom and superintendent would say as we head out onto the parade route. So we are thrilled to be celebrating them again, and as a follow-up to the drive-up graduation ceremonies, which were just so well planned and thoughtfully designed by the staff at each of our high schools. So we look forward to this car parade, and then later that same day on June 19th, between 6 and 7 p.m., each school will be releasing their virtual graduation ceremony on YouTube, and we will be simulcasting that on the Livonia cable station. So not only our parents and graduates can enjoy that, but our community can share in that special celebration as well. So while those online ceremonies may not have the same crowd enthusiasm of an in-person ceremony, it's certainly a heartfelt send-off. And congratulations to our class of 2020. We'll be sharing each graduate's photos. We have recordings of different graduation and commencement remarks from our students and from special guests. So we are looking forward to releasing that on Friday evening. And just really, again, a huge thank you to all of our staff and administrators at our schools and at the district level. And the feedback from our parents and staff is we really coordinated those special events for each of our seniors. So we are excited to celebrate them once again. And if you are out and about at that time in the afternoon or evening on Friday, please be sure to give them a wave or a honk in your very best. On another note, last Friday, all of our parents and all of our staff in the district should have received an important email with a slideshow and a screencast update that gave an update on our Return to Learn task force. If anyone has tuned in these past couple of meetings, we've spent quite a bit of time with the board talking about the structure and the plan for our task force work as we really begin to think about that return to school in the fall. And so we are proud to have over 210 staff members and parents from across the district, each school program level represented. They are hard at work and they are digging in. So if you haven't had a chance, it is about 7 or 8 minutes long, but it takes you through some nice detail about the task force work and who is involved in that work and the kinds of things that they're thinking about as we look forward to our Return to Learn next fall. So if you haven't had a chance to check that out, you may check your email, or we have a district dashboard that is on a designated portal on our website. So as soon as you open our district website, you'll see a new graphic called Return to Learn. So thank you to Katie Patterson and Stacy Jenkins, our small but mighty communications department, who have created this new spot on our website, similar to what we did during the COVID-19 closure, where we kept an ongoing portal of information for parents and staff. We're going to be doing the same thing with our return to learn. And so the slideshow is on there, and the first piece of information from one of our subgroups with regard to the return to athletic conditioning and activities, which start this week. So that information has been uploaded on the site, and we'll continue to upload information throughout the summer. So be sure to check that out, and that will be an important way for us to help keep you updated. Last week, we sent surveys from Mrs. O'Brien, our Chief Academic Officer, on behalf of the district to our students, our staff, and our parents regarding their experience during these past few months with remote learning. Questions were really focused on students' ability to access and participate in the remote learning. Both staff, parents, and students were able to give feedback on that process, some of the challenges they faced, and their level of participation during that time. And we have had a great response thus far. We've had almost 2,200 students reply to the survey, almost 600 staff that have replied, and we're inching up toward 4,000 parents responding to the survey. And so that is open through this evening. So once you've had a chance to watch this exciting meeting, hop onto your email and access that survey. We're really looking forward to your feedback. We'll be sharing that with the board at our July 13th study session, and certainly as applicable with our remote learning committee as well as we begin to plan for the fall. Later this meeting, there's an important resolution that we're going to be considering. So if you're not going to be sticking with us through until the end, I wanted to be sure to ask our community and our staff to take a look at either the final portion of this meeting when we talk about an important resolution we will be sending to our lawmakers, both at the state and the federal level, with regard to school funding. So we're going to ask the board to consider an important resolution, and we ask you to take a look at that email as it comes out tomorrow from President Johnson and myself. There will be a cover letter sharing some background information with regard to the purpose of the resolution, and then we will be sharing that, most importantly, with our lawmakers. So I had an opportunity to speak directly with Representative Haley Stevens this week about our concerns and about our desire at the federal level as well as at the state level to have intervention with regard to these significant revenue reductions that we are seeing for both this year and next year. So I certainly appreciate her time and responsiveness to that, and we look forward to sharing that widely with all of our legislators and encourage our community to be advocates for our students and our schools as well. Finally, if you can believe it, we wrapped up school year 1920. In some ways, I think people thought it took a bit forever, and in other ways, it just went by so quickly. It was hard to believe last Friday wrapped it up for our students. And so just a huge thank you once again to our amazing staff who really responded in a way that we could not have imagined when this first happened. We are grateful to each of them, and we are so proud of our students and our parents for their partnership with us and really digging in and learning and growing in a new way this past spring. And to all of our 12-month staff, oftentimes as we wrap up the school year, it sounds like we're all headed off towards summer. And, you know, we have a lot of staff throughout our district that are here all summer long doing some very important behind the scenes work. So they are really just gearing up. And I just want to give a big shout out to all of our staff who will be here throughout the summer preparing for our return to school. We appreciate you more than you know. So thank you so much, President Johnson, for allowing me to share some of those updates. And again, we look forward to sharing an important resolution with you at the end of this meeting.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist. It's always nice to hear the things that are going on. That'll move us into item 4, our consent agenda. And may I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Bradford.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the following consent agenda items as recommended by the superintendent. 5A, minutes of the regular meeting of May 18th, 2020. 6F, teacher recall authorization. 6G, authorization to accept resignations. 7A, approval to renew MHSAA membership for 2020-2021. 8A, approval of lease renewals for 2020-2021.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Jarvis. Are there any questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, to accept the consent agenda. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bradford,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mr. Centers,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson,
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. That takes us now to item 6A, appointment of high school principal. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Frank,
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent and appoint Pete Mazzani as the high school principal of Stevenson High School.
Support.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get it.
Support.
Mr. Centers? We have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mr. Centers. And is this going to be Mrs. Oquist?
It is going to be Mrs. Oquist. Thank you, President Johnson. So we are thrilled, and Pete is on the screen with us. In my screen, he's in the top right-hand corner. He may be somewhere else on your screen, but we are so thrilled to be making this recommendation to you this evening. I'd like to share a little bit of background about Mr. Mazzoni and then introduce you to him. So Pete has had 20 years of experience with Livonia Public Schools as a teacher, as a hockey coach, and as an administrator, as well as being a proud graduate of Stevenson High School and Livonia Public Schools. He has taught business at both Frost and Churchill, instructional technology, and was also the business department chairperson. He began his administrative career 8 years ago at Stevenson High School, has been part of that leadership team since 2012. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree in International Business and French from Adrian College. He has a Master of Arts in Business Education and his Educational Specialist degree from Nova Southeastern University. Pete has long been part of not only the work going on at Frost and Churchill and Stevenson, but also has been a member of our district evaluation committee, has been an integral part of helping us with training fellow administrators in that process. He's been a member of our district's QUAR team. That's our internal quality assurance review team, and an important member of our district safety team as well. Just as a few highlights from his contributions, not only at Stevenson, but at the district level. He is certainly a well-known and very well-respected member of the Stevenson leadership team, as well as our administrative leadership team in our district. He really has a compelling vision for Stevenson, and I know is eager to bring that forward in collaboration with the students, the staff, and the parent community. I want to thank the Stevenson staff for their input and feedback throughout this process. As you know, we always ask for that as we begin to build the profile of a leader. And that was very, very helpful to us as we worked through an outstanding group of candidates. I'd like to thank everyone who expressed an interest, who participated in this process. And we are very, very proud and pleased to bring forward to you a recommendation for Mr. Pete Mazzoni to take on the helm at Stevenson High School.
Pete, do you have a few words?
Yes,
We need to vote on the motion.
Do we need to vote first? All right. Any questions or comments from the board?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
As a longtime Stevenson parent, when our youngest graduated not too long ago from Stevenson, I'm thrilled to see Mr. Mazzoni taking on this position. You've been a face around Stevenson for a long, long time, obviously even longer than that in the district. And we're just thrilled to have your leadership continue and take on this position. It's always fabulous when we have a new principal coming into a position, but it is especially heartwarming when it is someone that we can promote from within, who already knows the tone and the culture of not only our school district, but in this case of that specific building, because you've been part of it for such a long time at this point. But we're just thrilled to have you in this position, and really excited to see your leadership taking another step as you guide the whole school. We're really excited to see you come forward at this time.
thank you.
Other questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Frank?
Congratulations, Pete. We are really thrilled and looking forward to your leadership and your vision that you have for the district. As my daughter is going to be a freshman, and so as you start your 10 years, she's starting her 10 year, and I think it's so great that there will be a group that you will journey with, and as you lead the group, as you lead the school, you will journey with this group, and they will grow as you grow. And so we are just, congratulations. It is such a great opportunity, and we're excited to learn and grow with you. So congratulations, Pete.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mrs. Bradford?
Thank you, President Johnson. I echo the sentiments of my board colleagues. We're really excited to see you in this new role, and I think it's going to be a great fit. And congratulations, looking forward to seeing how you navigate the new Stevenson High School and how it goes. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Any others? Mr. Centers?
I don't want to be left out. Congratulations, Pete. You're going to do a great job. We're excited to see, what you have in store for Stevenson. We know it's going to be really great.
Thank you, Mr. Centers. Others? Mrs. Jarvis?
See, you weren't the last one, Dan. Pete, congratulations. I can't think of a better person for this role. Once a Spartan, always a Spartan, and in your case, eternally a Spartan.
Thank you, Mrs. Jarvis. Others? I just echo what everybody else said, Pete. This is a great move. I fully support it, and you're going to do a great job. All right, if there are no other comments, then we have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mr. Centers, for the appointment of high school principal. Mrs. Bonifield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mr. Centers,
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford,
Yes.
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield says yes, and President Johnson.
Yes, motion passes. Congratulations, Pete.
Congratulations.
Fantastic.
Now, if you'd like to say a few words.
First of all, thank you, Superintendent and School Board, for this appointment. Very honored, very humbled to serve as the next leader of Stevenson. Livonia Public Schools in this community has provided me much of the foundation of who I am today. And to be able to pay it back is something that I'm not going to take lightly. It's a privilege to be able to do so. I understand with great excitement comes great expectations, and I look forward to serving not only our students, but this community as we try to return to a new normal and what that may look like. And I can't wait to get started. Again, thank you for your support, and I look forward to working with you more in the future here.
Thank you, Pete.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That'll take us to item 6B, appointment of elementary principal. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mr. Centers,
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent and appoint Diana Shaheen as elementary principal.
Support.
all right, I had multiple voices. I heard Mrs. Frank. So we have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Frank. And once again is Mrs. Oquist will handle this for us.
Thank you so much. And Mrs. Shaheen has joined us in my bottom left-hand corner. So she's waving at you right now. And Deanna, thank you for joining us this evening. So I'd like to share a little bit of background about Mrs. Shaheen. She has been in education for 13 years. She started her career as a teacher in Dearborn Public Schools in 2007. She moved to the Crestwood School District as an English language learner teacher in 2014 and has been the proud principal of Hillcrest Elementary since 2015 for the past 5 years. She has a Bachelor of Science in Elementary Education from Eastern Michigan University, a Master of Arts in Bilingual and Bicultural Education from Wayne State University, and she has her Educational Specialist degree in Administration and Supervision, also from Wayne State University, and she is currently working on her doctorate. Well, we're so thrilled to help you get to know Mrs. Shaheen. She is a passionate educator with high energy and enthusiasm who impressed our team from the start. She has diverse leadership and teaching experience, has had the opportunity to work with students of all needs across all spectrums, and we believe will be a tremendous asset to the Roosevelt school community as she brings that forward. She is student-centered and eager to become part of the outstanding team at Roosevelt Elementary School. And speaking of that outstanding team, they also provided us very thoughtful and insightful feedback as we created the profile of a leader for Roosevelt Elementary. And we know they care greatly about their school community as well. And we believe that we have found that individual to fit the profile of a leader in Indiana. And we are thrilled that she will be, to recommend her to join us as part of our administrative leadership team in Livonia Public Schools.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist. Any questions or comments from the board? Mr. Centers.
We just want to say welcome. You're going to find that the school community you're joining is just really great, really awesome, great parents, great staff. And I think you're really going to enjoy your time here in LPS, and just wanted to say welcome officially.
Thank you so much. I'm confident I will.
Thank you, Mr. Centers. Other questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Jarvis.
I just wanted to echo what my colleague said and welcome you to LPS. We look forward to having you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mrs. Jarvis. Other questions or comments? Mrs. Burton.
Yes, thank you. Welcome. We're thrilled to have you. And I know the Roosevelt community, while they're sad to see Mr. Green moving on, they're very, very excited and anxious to find out who their new leader is going to be. And with all of your background and experiences, we're thrilled to have you join that community. Just want to say welcome, and we can't wait to get to know you better.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Other questions or comments at this point? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Frank, to approve the appointment of elementary principal. Mrs. Bonifield, would you take the roll, please?
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Okay. Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Excellent. Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Okay. Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield says yes, and President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Superintendent Oquist, for your kind words, and school board members for being here and giving me this opportunity. I couldn't be more honored to be here this evening and to accept my new role very seriously as Roosevelt Elementary School principal and to join the Livonia Public School District family. I'd like to take a moment to send a special thank you to the interview team that went through this process with me. They were so dedicated and kind throughout. And just to extend my gratitude to Mr. Bill Green for being an exceptional leader and support already. Over the weekend, I've had multiple Roosevelt staff members reach out to me just to offer their support and warm welcome. And I'm so deeply touched by their kind gesture. I've already been embraced by the LPS family in an unprecedented way, and that really speaks volumes about the culture and climate in the district, and I'm so excited to be a part of it. I'm genuinely humbled and honored to serve the Livonia Public School community and will continue to advocate for students, families, and support staff with compassion and empathy. And that is my promise to you all. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Congratulations. All right, moving on.
Congratulations.
Anybody else?
Congratulations.
Welcome to the team. That moves us on to item 6C, resignations. This is just for our information, and there is no motion. That takes us to item 6D, retirements. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnston,
Mrs. Jarvis.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District adopt the attached resolutions of appreciation for the services rendered by Lynn Carey, Cheryl Carroll, Tracy Favaro, Jean Fuller, Kim Martin, Mark Pietka, and Tara Wells.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Bradford. And Mr. McDonald, are you going to handle this one?
I will. Thank you, President Johnson. Tonight, we are very pleased. We're bringing before you 7 employees who will be retiring at the end of the school year, which officially has taken place already for most. As these employees leave the Livonia Public Schools, they will take with them a combined total of 152 years of experience. And on behalf of the administration, I would like to thank these employees for their dedicated years of service that they have provided our students of the Livonia Public Schools. And I ask that the board adopts the attached resolutions of appreciation for these retirees.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Questions, comments from the board?
Thank you for all the years of service.
Congratulations.
Absolutely, and best wishes on whatever you choose to do in the next chapter. All right, we have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Bradford, to accept the resolutions of appreciations for employees who are retiring. Mrs. Bonifield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford,
Yes.
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mr. Centers,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. That takes us to item 6E, notification of discontinuance of teaching contracts. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mr. Centers.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent that the teachers as listed be laid off for the school year 2020-21, and that their teaching contracts not be renewed at the end of the 2019-20 school year. As is further resolved, that the records show that the reasons for this action are a result of the budget process, the district's financial situation, enrollment changes, teachers returning from leave, and program changes. May it be further resolved that the Board of Education direct the Secretary of the Board to send a letter to each of the individuals listed, officially notifying them that their teaching contracts will not be renewed at the end of the 2019-20 school year, and that they will be laid off as teachers in the Livonia Public Schools School District.
Support.
We have a motion by Mr. Center, supported by Mrs. Burton, and again, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, President Johnson. At this time each year, the district must make that difficult decision as to whether or not to lay off any teachers. As Trustee Centers mentioned, we consider the current and projected budgets, the current and anticipated enrollment changes, employees returning from leave, and changes to programs when making this decision. The determination of teachers presented tonight for layoff is consistent with board policy and administrative procedures. The district is obligated to provide notice to these employees who will be laid off. At this time, we are optimistic that we will be able to recall some of these employees. Tonight, I ask that you approve the notification of the discontinuance of these teaching contracts.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Do you have questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Burton.
So the public is aware also, we, as part of our consent agenda just a few moments ago, we also authorized the approval to begin calling back any of these teachers as soon as our folks are able in our administration to make certain that we have the appropriate positions for them.
Thank you for making that point, Mrs. Burton. Other questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Oquist.
Thank you so much, President Johnson. I wanted to certainly echo Mr. McDonald's comments that this is always one of the most difficult times of the year. And whether we have a very small number or whatever the number is, even one, we know impacts a staff member who has served our students throughout this school year. One thing I do want to do is be sure to acknowledge the efforts of the board as we've worked through the budget these past number of weeks, because this number is as low as it possibly can be, thanks to the continued commitment of the board in accepting the recommendations that we are making with regard to the budget and keeping as many of these budget impacts away from the classroom and the staff who serve our students. So again, while even one is one more than we would like, I certainly do want to acknowledge that this number for a district that is facing a $9 million revenue reduction this year and another one next year, this could be much more significant. And it really is the board's commitment and willingness to review and accept those recommendations to really keep our focus on staffing to support our students directly in our classrooms and in our schools. So I wanted to be sure that that was not lost upon that in this process, because this may look very different across the state of Michigan. And we are fortunate to be in a position where we are able to mitigate that as much as possible due to our fund balance.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist. Any other questions, comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mr. Center, supported by Mrs. Burton, to accept the notification of discontinuance of teaching contracts. Mrs. Bonifield, would you take the roll, please?
Mr. Centers,
Yes.
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield says yes. President Johnson,
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. That takes us now down to item 7B, as item 6F, G, and 7A were disposed of under our consent agenda. So item 7B is approval to purchase French textbooks, levels 3, 4, and 5. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Bradford.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District purchase Tay Branchet 2019 as the digital and hard copy textbook and curriculum for French 3, 4, and 5 from Carnegie Learning for all 3 of our high schools for a total cost of $42,798.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Jarvis. And we'll hear from Mrs. O'Brien. Good evening.
Good evening. I am having some buffering issues, so if I need to turn my camera off, if you will let me know so that it's a little smoother. This recommendation comes as a part of our plan to update and replace our district textbooks. Mr. Matt Miga, our world language teacher leader, has worked with his teams of teachers for the past 3 years to update our world language curriculum and are recommending a continuation of the program that we purchased for level 1 and 2, Té Branché for our level 3, 4, and 5 French classes. This committee is looking for consistency across all 5 levels of French and is looking to use the level 2 book with French 3 and us purchasing level 3 book for French 4 and 5. Té Branché also publishes a level 4 book, but it is aligned to the AP French curriculum, and we do not offer that course. This purchase includes free teacher materials and includes an 8-year license, student textbooks, e-readers, which are some French story reading, and the Passport program, which immerses students in culture and context in an engaging platform. The total cost again is $42,798 and comes from our secondary textbook budget, been supported by the Wayne County Enhancement Millage monies.
Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien. Questions and comments from the board? Mrs. Burton.
Yes, Mrs. O'Brien, as you discussed it with us in our committee of the whole, can you explain for the benefit of the public the reason that we're using a textbook over a 2-year period?
Yes. So the textbooks align with the standards for world languages, but our teachers want to go in depth with the culture of each language culture. So they want to go in deeper with each one of the world languages. And instead of its focus, the standards are now focused on a depth instead of a breadth instead of a depth, and having students being focused on the written conjugation of verbs and some of those ways that we learned world languages. Instead, it's on the spoken communication and the written communication, and then the understanding of the culture.
Okay, great. And then my second question, because I continue to get this question every time we adopt textbooks, can you address our purchase of hard copy versus online forms of the book?
Yes, so this purchase actually includes both textbooks and the digital license. The license is for 8 years. And we have seen some beginning to changes that you could purchase and get some savings if you purchase one or the other, or some of one or the other. So if you remember with our world history books, we purchased just a classroom set of the textbooks and then licenses, the digital licenses for every student. So you can begin to save some money to do it that way. Our world language participation fluctuates each year a little bit, and so they were asking for the current course number of students so that they would have those books as time numbers change.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Other questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for the approval to purchase French textbooks, levels 3, 4, and 5. Mrs. Bonifield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bradford,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes, and President Johnson?
Yes. Motion carries. Thank you. That takes us to item 7C, approval to purchase fifth grade science textbooks. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson?
Mrs. Bonnefield?
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District purchase the textbook program Amplify from Amplify Science for grade 5 classrooms at a total cost of $58,427.60, which includes $5,867.60 in complimentary shipping, professional development.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Jarvis. And again, Mrs. O'Brien.
Thank you, President Johnson. This recommendation comes to us from our 5th grade curriculum committee that was looking to extend the science curriculum we adopted last year for grades 6 through 8 and see if we would be interested in and it aligned to our 5th grade curriculum. One of our academic services goals is to provide some consistency at our 5th and 6th grade upper elementary buildings. Most of programs end at K-5 and then have additional programs that are 6 through 8. So Amplify was one program where we could see we could build some consistency at our upper elementary. Our pilot teachers began to pilot one unit right before the school closure, so got a few lessons in with their whole classes in person, but Amplify opened up their platform to all of our teachers during the school closure, so all of our 5th grade teachers were able to access and use the curriculum. We are recommending purchasing 3 units for next year, and this would provide that consistency for students and for teachers to be able to collaborate around science together. The purchase would include free shipping and handling and 1 day of professional development. So that would be $58,427.60. That would come from the elementary textbook budget, which has been enhanced also with Wayne County Enhancement Millage monies.
Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, to approve the purchase of 5th grade science textbooks. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
President Johnson?
Yes. Motion carries. Thank you. That takes us now to item 8B. 8A was included in our consent agenda. So item 8B is approval of purchase agreement for vacant district property. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson?
Mrs. Burton?
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approved delegating to the superintendent or her designee the authority to enter into an offer to purchase real estate and execute said offer and any documents necessary and incidental to the sale with Adams Park Development, LLC, whereby Adams Park Development, LLC has offered to purchase 12.71 plus or minus acres of land located at 28201 Linden Street, Livonia, Michigan, formerly known as Adams Elementary, for a total of $852,000.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bradford. And we're going to hear this evening from Mr. Francis. Good evening.
Good evening, everybody. The sale of this parcel is something that the board has discussed on multiple different meetings or during multiple different meetings. And in fact, the price of the $852,000 that has been offered by Adams Park Development LLC was also discussed previously, and the board had agreed to that. What we're bringing to the board now for your approval and ratification is the document, which is basically what most people would call a purchase agreement. This is the agreement to purchase that land. It has been negotiated through our attorney and with the folks at Adams Park Development LLC, which is actually a joint venture with Windmill and SDC, both developers. And this property sale will probably take most of the upcoming school year / fiscal year to complete. As we've discussed previously with the other two properties with a different developer, there's quite a bit of due diligence that would occur. And with the recent shutdowns and uncertainty, there's just a patience factor, but we do expect this to be the way the timeline in the agreement that the board is voting on this evening. The timeline, the standard timeline, even with some extensions, still maps out on a calendar into the spring of 21 for an aimed close date. The $852,000 from the sale would be deposited into the district's general fund.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bradford, for the approval of purchase agreement for vacant district property. Mrs. Bonifield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Burton,
Sorry about that. Yes.
Mrs. Bradford,
Yes.
Mr. Centers,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield says yes, and President Johnson.
Yes, motion carries. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Francis.
Thank you.
That now takes us to item 8C, approval to purchase secondary fitness equipment. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mr. Centers,
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the purchase of new exercise equipment for the weight and exercise rooms at all 3 high schools and 2 middle schools from Matrix Fitness for a total of $93,431.22.
Support.
we have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Jarvis. And Mrs. O'Brien will help us with this one.
Thank you again. I bring this recommendation from Mrs. Archibald and her secondary PE committee. They had a plan this year to review what needs our fitness centers and our weight rooms had. And the equipment, and many of the pieces of equipment were anywhere from 7 to 30 years old. We put out a bid and had 5 bidders, and Matrix Fitness is who we are recommending. They are a company we've done business with before, and we are recommending them because they came with a service plan for repairing. And we have a relationship that we have found they are very timely and responsive when we have needs, and have supported the district in the past with repairs. That's just come from the 2013 bond.
Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien. Questions or comments from the board?
No.
President Johnson? Oh,
Yes, Mrs. Frank.
I just think we did talk about this in great length at the last meeting at the committee of the whole, and Mrs. Archibald was here to give a lengthy explanation. I don't think we need to rephrase it now, but if anybody does have questions, to go back and to watch that. If anybody in the community is wanting any more detail on any of these that we're going fairly quickly through, we had lengthy discussions, as we always do, in both the study session and the committee of the whole. So there was lots of discussion about it and explanation, and that's One of the reasons we're going through a little bit quicker tonight is because we've talked in length about it.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. And that goes for all of the items. We've discussed these at length at other meetings. Any other questions or comments? Mrs. O'Brien, one question I have is, we're actually replacing machinery? Is that correct?
Yes. Some of the equipment are replacements. Some things were replaced with the PEP grant from 2014. And so this was an evaluation of what equipment needs to be fixed or replaced, or, you know, we have new needs in some of our exercise rooms, fitness centers.
And what do we do with the old equipment?
I am not sure, so I would not want to say, but I can find out from Mrs. Archibald. Oh, or Mrs. Oquist.
Mrs. Oquist is chiming in.
Mrs. Smith, did you want to hop in first and then I can
Sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so depending on the status or of the equipment that we're replacing, if it can still be used, we look for other locations in the district. Like some of the high school equipment has moved to the middle schools if it's still in working condition. We also have a mechanism for selling excess property, and we'll sell it at auction. And sometimes, you know, what we no longer need, people can, you know, find uses for. So we also sometimes get revenue from those things. So they'll either be repurposed for other uses or used other places, or we'll sell the excess property through an auction to get revenue for that equipment.
Great, thank you.
Well, Mrs. Smith covered that so well. That really, I just wanted to highlight that we have been able to actually outfit some of our middle schools with some smaller fitness centers where they have been able to locate that. And as we received the PEP grant over those number of years, and now with some of the bond dollars to replace some of that equipment, it really has been a way to expand the sphere of this equipment throughout the district to students at both levels. And that has actually been very helpful. And where we can do that safely, we absolutely will. Otherwise, really, some of these pieces, we will say, truly are at end of life and will be properly disposed of at that point.
Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments on this item? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for the approval to purchase secondary fitness equipment. Mrs. Bonifield, would you take the roll?
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield says yes. And President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. Thank you so much. That takes us now to item 8D, approval to purchase flexible furniture for English language learners classrooms, 2013 bond. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson?
Mrs. Bonifield.
I'm getting there, sorry.
I tried to talk slow.
I was sidetracked with my voting. Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. One more. Okay, here we go. Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District purchase flexible furniture for our English language learners classrooms from Interior Environments, including 3 sets of teaching tables and seats and 4 sets of sunshine on a cloudy day tables and seats for a total cost of $18,207.
Support.
And I didn't catch who?
Support.
Mrs. Burton. We have a motion by Mrs. Bonifield, supported by Mrs. Burton. And again, is this Mrs. O'Brien?
It is. Thank you, President Johnson. This purchase, over the last couple of years, we've been purchasing flexible furniture for our classrooms. And as we have reached near the end of our bond life, we looked at some of the other spaces that want to provide students the opportunity to wiggle and move and sit in something different and learn at a different kind of a table. And one of the places that we identified this year was our English language learner classrooms. This was an opportunity for those teachers to look at some different kinds of seats. So not a hokey stool, but a seat that's partially rounded on one side that a student could roll a little bit and flat on the other for them to sit, or they could go the other way and it would stay stable and they would sit on the curved side. Both tables, both the teaching and the sunshine on cloudy day table are a whiteboard top table. So a teacher and a student could write on top of the table as they're working together in small group. These items are for Johnson, Rosedale, Coolidge, and Hoover. They are schools where we have identified classrooms for our English language learners to work in throughout the day. And these funds are from our 2013 bond, and it is for $18,207.
Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien. Questions or comments from the board? Not seeing any. So we have a motion by Mrs. Bonifield, supported by Mrs. Burton for the approval to purchase flexible furniture for English language learners classrooms. Mrs. Bonifield, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Benefield says yes. Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mr. Centers,
Yes.
and President Johnson.
Yes. Motion carries. Thank you very much. That takes us to item 8E, adoption of 2019-2020 final budget amendment. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Jarvis.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District adopt the attached amended budgets for the 2019-20 school year. General Fund, Funded Projects Fund, Special Education Fund, Food Services Fund, Health and Welfare Fund, School Activities Fund, Scholarship Fund, Debt Retirement Funds, 2013 Bond Series 1, 2013 Bond Series 2, 2014 Refunding Bond, Capital Project Funds, 2013 Bond Fund, Sinking Fund, Technology Fund, and Capital Projects Fund.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Frank, and we'll hear from Mrs. Smith.
Thank you, President Johnson. We sure do have a lot of funds, don't we?
We do.
So I do want to say for our community, again, our discussion tonight might seem brief, but these are the budget amendment we're voting on tonight, or the board's voting on tonight, actually began back in April with discussions that started in April. We continued into May, and we're also discussed at the study session and committee meeting in June. So I did want to give some of the highlights from those discussions, but again, the conversation obviously is a little briefer because we have gone over this so thoroughly leading up to tonight. Some of the revenue adjustments include a $650 per pupil cut to our general fund, which is about $9 million. Again, we don't know how that will pan out. We do know that there's a shortfall in the state aid fund, and so we're planning for some cut to our general fund this year, and that's something again we became aware of in mid-May. I'm also I have made an adjustment for a delayed payment in the Wayne County Enhancement Millage to the tune of about $900,000. that's not money that we won't be receiving, but there's a potential that it won't be received in time to count it for the 1920 school year. I've also included a $1.6 million transfer, a one-time transfer from our health and welfare fund into the general fund. I've also included fully utilizing our Section 31A at-risk funds for this current school year, so leaving no carryover for next year. And I've also made various revenue adjustments to the tune of about $600,000. Due to the closure, we've seen some of our revenues decrease over what we projected. That's largely programs that are fee-based programs that obviously have ceased, and so those revenues weren't collected. That's also athletic refunds for the athletic season in the spring. Because that wasn't able to operate, we did refund families for the revenue they had paid to the district for that. On the expenditure side, we had a number of adjustments. The first grouping were some delayed expenditures, such as a school bus purchase and textbook purchases. And it's not that these won't take place, they just won't be taking place before June 30th. So those have been removed from the 1920 budget and included in the 2021 budget. We also had a number of savings due to the closure. The sub costs have gone down. The extra duty stipends have been decreased, a decrease in contracted security costs, a decrease in athletic expenditures, and then we also had some various other adjustments that have been included in this final budget amendment.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Burton.
As I stated in the public hearing portion of our evening, the previous meeting, the $650 cut, we are not even 100% certain it's going to happen, but that's the best information that we have right now. And we need to budget not on what we hope to happen, but what we know as the most accurate fact to date. And please, I want our public not to take any, not to misunderstand this for a moment, that the board is supportive of the $650 cut. We are actively advocating statewide and nationally that public education be funded properly. It wasn't even fully funded properly before this cut, let alone with $650 being taken from a year that had a few weeks left to go. But be that as it may, we are continuing to fight for proper funding of education, but we must vote tonight on a budget that is the best information that we have right now.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Well said. Other questions or comments? Mrs. Frank.
I think this is for Mrs. Oquist, and I get the assumption that some people say the kids weren't even in school, so why did your budget not go down drastically? And I know that Mrs. Smith spoke a little bit on some of the savings that we had, but Mrs. Oquist, you want to speak a little bit on the fact that we that in order for schools to continue to get their state aid payment, we did have to pay our staff 100%.
Yes, certainly. So really from the point of the closure moving forward, we were given the directive from the start that we would continue to have the ability to pay our staff through the remainder of the school year, because we would be receiving full state aid throughout the remainder of the school year through the end of the fiscal year of June 30th. That was the message we had received throughout that period of time. And we still continue to incur costs in addition to those salaries, but in running the district, including the transition to remote learning. Additionally, we also had certainly some savings, especially with regard to transportation costs, fuel costs, some substitute teacher costs that we did not incur, but we also had a significant loss in revenue from the point of March 16th moving forward. Especially as Mrs. Smith said, in our fee-based program, we also did provide refunds to families for those fee-based programs and during the spring season for our pay to participate fees as well. So we also had a loss in revenue from the use of, for instance, our performing arts centers or other rentals agreements that we had for childcare centers that utilize entire schools of ours. So we had, again, a significant loss of revenue. We did also have savings in our expenditures, and those are both reflected within. But you are correct in that we did continue to pay all of our staff throughout this closure. And we, as part of that agreement with the state, we were told from the beginning that we would continue to receive state funding through the end of this year. So certainly this in mid-May, to receive the information that we would be so drastically cut to the tune of up to $9 million for this current school year was certainly a significant development.
Thank you.
And I want to
Thank
make
you.
note, also with very little time to be able to make shifts in our expenditures for the remainder of those last few weeks of school, while we did do freezing of any unnecessary purchases, any additional supplies or expenditures. There were obviously many commitments that were already made with just a few weeks in the school year remaining.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist. Other questions or comments on this particular item? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Frank, to adopt the 2019-2020 final budget amendment. Mrs. Bonifield, would you take the roll, please?
Yes. Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford,
Yes.
Mr. Centers,
Yes.
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield is a yes, and President Johnson.
Yes. Motion carries. Thank you. That takes us now to item 8F, adoption of 2020-2021 proposed budgets and millage rates. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Frank.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools adopt the attached proposed budget for the 2020-2021 school year. General Fund, Funded Projects Fund, Special Education Fund, Food Services Fund, Health and Wellness Fund, School Activities Fund, Scholarship Fund, Debt Retirement Funds, 2013 Bond Series 1, 2013 Bond Series 2, 2014 Refunding Bond, Capital Projects Funds, 2013 Bond Fund, Sinking Fund, Technology Fund, Capital Projects Fund, and Replacement Sinking Fund.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Jarvis. And once again, we'll hear from Mrs. Smith.
Thank you, President Johnson. Again, I'll go over some of the assumptions that went into the budget for the 2021 school year. We assumed that the budget cut we're planning for in the 2019-20 school year of a $650 per pupil cut will carry over into the 2021 school year. We've also budgeted for a student loss of about 200 students. We've also put in a transfer from our special education fund. We've bumped that transfer up by $500,000. We've also budgeted for the sale of 3 of our properties, the revenue coming from that, Old Webster, Adams, and Wilson. We've also included federal funding that we'll be receiving through the CARES Act, through the ESSER grant. On the expenditure side, I've backed out one-time purchases that we had in the 1920 school year. I've included the purchase of the 22 propane buses, 60% coming from our general fund, and the remaining 40% funded from a grant that we've applied for and have been awarded. We've also made adjustments to the revenue for the increase in retirement rate set by the state. Also an increase in health insurance costs as determined by the hard cap. I've also put in retirement savings from staff retiring being replaced by new hires. I've also made the adjustment to our expenditures for the second year of our 3-year collective bargaining agreements. And I've also put in some targeted budget reductions so that we will have an ending fund balance of 12% for the 2021 school year.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Burton?
Mrs. Smith, we went over this in the committee of the whole, but for the benefit of the public who may not have listened to that meeting, can you explain the rationale behind the transfer from special education fund to the general fund?
I sure will. So in a few of our funds, we have maintained a targeted fund balance. Within the special education fund, our target was about $1 million. And that's for unforeseen things that might come up that wouldn't be paid for from the county, that the district would be required to pay. But as we examine that, we feel comfortable that we could reduce that target fund balance down to 500,000 and transfer an additional 500,000 to the general fund where it is needed. Again, it's a priority of the board and the district to maintain current staffing levels and the supports we've been able to put in place for our students. So to do so is requiring us to look to some other funds for transfers. So I've included that in there. Over time, we will have the opportunity to build back that fund balance in the special education fund. But this would be, my recommendation would be to utilize those funds for the 2021 school year in the general fund.
And it's my understanding also, I'm sorry, Mrs. Oquist, go ahead first.
I was just going to add that this in no way, shape, or form impacts the delivery of services to our special education students across the district. These dollars are put into the special education fund balance as a result of indirect costs that the district maintains. So for instance, staff who may be working on the hiring, our personnel staff who work on the hiring of staff for our special education programs, we receive a small portion of certain staff members' salary who help support our special education programming. So I just want to be abundantly clear that the shift in moving this from the fund balance to the general fund in no way, shape, or form impacts our full commitment and all of the delivery of services in each of our special education programs.
Thank you, Ms. Oquist. Just to add on to that, again, that fund balance in the special education fund was created over the years, again, from indirect costs that the county recognizes the district is incurring as we operate the county programs, as well as rent. They give us a portion or some money for use of our buildings. So that is something that could have been transferred to the general fund kind of all along, but we had been conservative and decided to, build up a little bit of a savings in that special education fund for maybe some projects down the line. But again, this will not have any impact on the instruction for our students in those programs.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Other questions or comments, Mrs. Bonifield?
Mrs. Smith, I apologize. I'm sure it's in here. What was the total of the targeted budget reductions?
400,000.
And that's the final number that we came up with?
Yes, we did some rearranging of what the reductions would be, but that is what we've been able to do.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions or comments? Mrs. Frank?
I'm sorry. I feel like we have talked about this bus purchase for 2 years, but I just think it is important to know, and you said it in our the whole meeting, Mrs. Smith, but I do think it's important to notice that you did look into seeing if we can cancel that bus purchase, but it was already, we had been on this road for a long time, knowing we had the fund balance and knowing we were getting a portion of the grants to pay for it. And so that there's that piece of, we know we're in a $9 million budget cut, but we were not able to cancel that purchase. And I just think that is important to say in this meeting as well.
Yep. And just to build on that too, the buses that these are replacing are back, I believe they're 2000, maybe 8, something, 2007. They're, buses that have reached the end of their useful life. So this wasn't kind of a wish purchase for us. Like, this was a necessity that these buses really have come to the end of their useful life. So we were very fortunate that we had this grant opportunity that came along to help us fund that. And again, this was a purchase that we had applied for the funds, and we brought it to the board back in the fall. It started in the fall, and we've been just waiting kind of on that official go ahead from the granting agencies that we could go ahead and purchase them. So that did come through this spring, and the order was placed before we learned of the pending budget cut. So as soon as we did learn of the pending budget cuts, we did reach out to the manufacturer to find out if they had been put into production yet, with the idea that if they hadn't, maybe we could put it on hold and rediscuss with the board when would be the optimal time to purchase them. But the manufacturer did get going on building those buses for us as soon as we gave them the purchase order. So, we felt like the right thing would be to stick with our commitment, obviously, that we had made to them and move forward with the purchase.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Any other questions or comments? Mrs. Burton.
And Mrs. Smith, we are receiving a grant for 40% of that purchase, correct? Thank you.
That's true. Yes. Which is wonderful. It was with the fuel source that we're going with, the propane offered this kind of a larger reimbursement. So 40% of the cost of each of the buses will come from this grant.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Mrs. Smith, you have made this seem so seamless in all of these cuts, but we know that you have spent countless hours given the urgency of getting this budget done to move parts around, and it's not easy. It's like a chess game that somebody moved all your pieces. So we completely understand. We are grateful to you and your staff for everything you've done to be able to not only get the budget amendment done, but a budget for the end of the month that we can all live with. So thank you so much for that. We appreciate it. If there are no other questions or comments, we have a motion by we have Mrs. Bonifield.
I'm sorry. I know this is really hard for all of us. Mrs. Smith, can you talk a little bit about, we've talked at the last couple of meetings, just talk a little bit about the sustainability of this, that, we've been extremely frugal and careful with our budget. We are going to be potentially impacted over the next 2 years, almost $20 million in our budget, that a little bit that we have gone in and tried to make some cuts where we can. That's not to say that they're not painful cuts, but ones that we have thought that we can live with for the next 2 years. The fact that we are eating into our fund balance, and again, which is why we have it here, but it's money that's we will never recoup. And then that a little bit about how unsustainable this is if the state doesn't even if we do have to sustain these $20 million in cuts for the 2 years, that the third year is going to be, this is an unsustainable projected track.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yep. We're definitely found ourselves in a better position than we've been in the last number of years. As we look at what our fund balance was, just going back even to 2014, we were looking at a $3.8 million fund balance, or 2.5%. Through the decisions of the board, we've been able to build that fund balance up. Before the news that we would see this $650 per pupil cut, we were anticipating closing this school year off with a 20% fund balance. It's because of that fund balance that we can be very mindful moving forward on the budget reductions that we potentially do have to make. Again, this was something that we've learned of within the last few weeks of what this cut is. And what the fund balance allows us to do is have time to make adjustments, to form budget forums, allow the state funding to work itself out. Again, we're going off of the information that we have today. We don't know if potentially federal funding sources might come through, or maybe some other sources within the state might come through to alleviate some of this cuts. So it really felt premature to make some drastic cuts to our programming before we had all of the information. So again, because our fund balance is where it is, we are kind of allowing ourselves to maintain our programs as they currently are. We anticipate getting information over the next couple of months of what the funding actually will be. And then again, that allows us time to meet with our staff, to meet with our community, our parents, and have some really thoughtful discussions on what adjustments might need to take place if this really is the reality that we're working with. So as you said, Ms. Bonnefield, we are fully aware that the expenditures we're proposing are outpacing the revenue we're bringing in for this coming year, as well as what we saw for this coming year. That isn't a sustainable model. You know, eventually the savings will dissipate. And so again, it was for this very reason that we built up these funds so that we could maintain our programs the way we are. But we're very conscious that we can't continue to outpace the revenue we're bringing in, that some change will have to come. But again, we're so thankful for the board that you've supported this budget that we proposed to you, because again, I think we can be very thoughtful with the decisions before us for the remainder of the 2021 school year and potentially for the following year.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. The other thing, I just another thing that I sort of want to point it out was that what came from a very low fund balance, and we've worked very hard to bring it up to a reasonable amount. And can you just talk a little bit about how increasing the fund balance is not an unending thing, that where we come out with the 15 to 20%, and that, you know, we had worked very hard to get up to that fund balance percentage, and that once we got there, it was allowing us to then start adding back in some of the things that we had lost over the years, because we were able to bring that fund balance up to where it should be. And then rather than keep, you know, it's 25, 30, 35, 40, that once we got to the sustainable 15 to 20%, that we were then able to start spending a little bit more of our money because we didn't have to put that savings back into the pot.
Yep, exactly. When we talk about our fund balance, we typically talk about it as a percentage of our expenditures, and that's really so we can compare apples to apples when we're looking at other districts. And again, what the recommendation is, because the same dollar amount as a fund balance really wouldn't be comparable from district to district. So what we've historically looked at is the Michigan School Business Officials recommended range of 15 to 20% fund balance. And they recommend that for a variety of reasons. And, you know, one of the major ones is largely our revenue sources are out of the district's control. You know, so much of our revenue comes from the state. And so, so that we can weather changes in the in state funding, that's why you have this savings built up, so that you can not have to make such drastic cuts, you know, immediately, that you can be, again, mindful with that. So I've totally blanked. I'm so sorry on where I was heading with this. We were talking about the, I'm so sorry.
No, that's
Thank you,
okay.
Ms.
We
Oakley.
were.
I'd be happy to hop in for a quick minute and
Thank you,
work with
Mrs.
you on
Oakley.
that. Is absolutely one of the things that this fund balance has allowed us to do once we were able to stabilize, and really we moved from being an early warning district where we had to report out to the Treasury on a regular basis all actions of our expenditures, and do those additional reporting sequences during that period of time. So certainly we not only wanted to move back into a full level of local independence on our fiscal decisions, but also to be able to look at the programs that had been so impacted by budget cuts over many, many years, and to begin to restore some of those pieces. And while we were not completely there, we have made significant inroads because of the stability of the fund balance. And those priority areas that we identified with regard to class size of our students in our classrooms, the offerings and programs for our students, as you know, we've been able to grow those for the first time in many years over the past couple of years, both curricular offerings and co-curricular offerings for our students. We have been able to bring agreements forward for all 6 of our employee groups in these past 2 rounds of bargaining agreements that have really been able to put our staff on that well-deserved, continued path of being recognized and valued for the work that they do, which for so many years had been stagnant. In addition to that, we have been able to begin that process of the textbook replacement cycle, which again had been frozen for many years. So we've been able to put some additional supports directly to students in the classroom, additional ESTs and SAP support, as well as literacy coaches to help with job embedded professional development. So many of those things that had shifted over the years and had been reduced, we certainly felt that impact in our schools, in our classrooms. And while the district over those years worked very hard to keep those cuts away from the classroom as much as possible, it really was inevitable. And what this has allowed us to do is have the stability to not only know that we were not a financial early warning district, but we were a very stable district. That's increased our bond rating. That has allowed us to not have to borrow dollars each year to cover payroll while we wait for state aid payments. And most importantly, it's been able to do those things that we've mentioned, which are to restore those supports and services to our students in schools. So that is entirely an outstanding focus for the work over these past few years. And we really want to continue to work toward that and get back to that. As you have said, this is not a sustainable model. We certainly understand that. But as Mrs. Smith said, we want to take this next year. And I think we talked about this at an earlier meeting, to really go back out, to listen to our community, to listen to our staff, to listen to our administrative team and our parents, to say, what do we value and what are, just as we did back in 2015, what are the things that we feel are essential to keep in place? And then what are those areas where we may look to make some changes if needed? So again, that fund balance has been very essential for us over these past few years. And certainly we see that in this budget amendment, as well as the proposed budget for next year.
Okay, if you'll allow me just 1 minute, I remember where I was going with that. Ms. Bonifield, you had mentioned about kind of what our target is with the fund balance, and just to reassure everybody, our intention with the fund balance wasn't to grow that to, 100% fund balance or anything like that. We have a number of needs that we've identified that if we had the funding for, we would put in place. So really, once we got into the recommended range, we would utilize those fund balances for the students in front of us today. It was really disappointing. We spent a lot of time as a cabinet team working with our administrators and staff in the district to come up with recommended adds for this 2021 school year. And obviously those quickly became put on hold when we learned of the pending cuts. We knew that those wouldn't be possible, but if we did find ourselves with the a fund balance that was growing, again, we would look to put additional resources in the classroom. And that was something that was pretty eye-opening within the last couple of years too. There was a report that came out from the Michigan School Research Collaborative that their question, what they were trying to answer was, what does it cost to educate a child? And we learned there that the targeted foundation allowance for students or for school districts would be about $9,500 per pupil. And just this year, we were at about $8,500 per pupil. So, $1,000 under what the research suggests would be appropriate funding for schools. So not only were we $1,000 under where the research said we should be funded, now on top of that, we're looking at a $650 cut. So definitely there's additional supports we would have liked to put in place, and we hope to, soon bring back to the board. But again, because of these pending cuts, we've had to put on hold. So it would not be our goal to recommend to the board that we try to build up the fund balance much above the 20% range. But again, it's for these very cases that we have built up this fund balance so that we can maintain our programs for our students.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, to accept or adopt the 2020-2021 proposed budgets and millage rates. Mrs. Bonifield, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford,
Yes.
Mr. Centers,
Yes.
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes, and President Johnson.
Yes, motion carries. Thank you all for the discussion. That takes us now to item 9, and our first item is A, resolution for school funding. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Bradford.
this is a good segue from right into our last conversation. All right, here we go. Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District adopt the attached resolution to support the passage of legislation by the U.S. Congress that would appropriate needed funds to be distributed to states and local districts due to severe budget shortfalls for the 2019-2020 and 2020-2021 school years, which are a direct result of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Support.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Frank. And Mrs. Bradford, I think at this time I'm going to ask you to read the resolution, if you would.
Yes, I will. Can you hear me okay? School funding budget shortfall due to COVID-19 pandemic. Whereas in March 2020, Michigan announced the first case within our state of the coronavirus disease, causing the governor to declare a state of emergency under her powers in the Michigan Constitution. And whereas in response to this emergency, after Michigan school districts were required to cancel in-person learning, school districts have risen to the challenge by being innovative and focused on their unique needs, providing distance learning for all Michigan students. And whereas the COVID-19 pandemic has created tremendous uncertainty on how to provide quality education while maintaining safe conditions for both staff and students, causing districts to face new expenses and challenges for the upcoming school year, including providing personal protective equipment, creating new health screening procedures, increased cleaning and sanitation costs, reorganization of learning spaces to accommodate social distancing, and expanded access to school-based mental health services for the social emotional well-being of our students. And whereas both the state and national economies have suffered greatly as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has dramatically reduced state and local revenue and placed enormous pressure on the state budget, including the state aid fund, which is predicted to be more than $1 billion per year below previous estimates for the current 2019-2020 school year and the upcoming 2020-2021 school year. And whereas, due to falling revenues, local school districts face severe budget shortfalls for the current 2019-2020 fiscal year, which ends June 30th, 2020, and the upcoming 2020-2021 school year, including a potential untenable proration cut of at least $650 per student, which equates to a reduction of nearly $19 million for Livonia Public Schools over these 2 school years, making it extraordinarily difficult to provide high-quality education, access to technology, and safety for both students and staff. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Livonia Public Schools School District supports the passage of legislation by the U.S. Congress appropriating needed funds to be distributed to states and local districts with maximum flexibility to fill budget gaps during this state of emergency. And be it further resolved, the Livonia Public Schools School District urges congressional action to provide additional funding for the highly successful E-rate program, which helps schools ensure connectivity for online learning. And be it further resolved that a copy of this resolution shall be transmitted to our governor and to all members of the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate representing the families in our district, as well as our state representatives. Adopted by the Board of Education of the Livonia Public School District, Wayne County, Michigan, at their regular meeting thereof held this 15th day of June, 2020.
Thank you, Mrs. Bradford. And Mrs. Oquist.
Thank you, President Johnson, and thank you, Mrs. Bradford, for bringing this forward to us. So really, this important resolution addresses the impending budget shortfalls we've discussed a few times this evening for our district and districts across the state, really caused by the sharp decrease in the state's school aid fund. Michigan sales tax, which accounts for about 50% of the state's school aid fund, is projected to be more than $1 billion short in the near term, as well as we move forward. And we've outlined in that resolution the impact it would have on our district for this fiscal year as well as next fiscal year. And so again, while we've talked about accruing this healthy fund balance that has been really carefully built over these past number of years, we really don't want to belie the very serious situation we have in the state of Michigan with regard to school funding. As Mrs. Smith mentioned, we are keenly aware of the disinvestment of schools and where Michigan ranks across our nation with regard to that. And the adequacy study really did highlight that issue of underfunding public schools, and this really only serves to exacerbate that problem. And so as I mentioned, I did have an opportunity to speak directly with Representative Stevens this past week and really talk about the imperative of this issue and the impact that this will have not only in Livonia, but in schools across Michigan, and the importance of the federal government partnering with our state to address this shortfall. So it's really important that our community is also active advocates for this, because certainly we share this on a regular basis, whether that's with our local legislators, state or federal. But it really is important that as a community, although we may not be feeling the direct impact right now in this budget, in the same way that other districts may, that as you've all mentioned, this isn't a sustainable model. And so we certainly do need to continue to be strong advocates for adequately funding our students in our schools. And so we will be sending out to our community this week a letter from President Johnson and myself that will accompany this resolution that the board is passing this evening. And we will urge our community to also make contact and be advocates for our students in our schools. And as always, we have a list of all of the legislators that represent our district and our students on our website under the community tab. We will also be linking that directly in the email letter that we send along with this resolution. So this will be sent to our representatives in Congress, Governor Whitmer, the Michigan House of Representatives, and the Michigan Senate. So again, we appreciate our board making this an important communication to send along this resolution in regard to both state and federal assistance for school funding.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist. Other questions or comments? Mrs. Bradford.
Did you guys hear me read that resolution, or was it muted? Okay.
No, we are here.
Thank you. After I finished it, my computer was muted. I couldn't hear any of you. So I thought, geez, I just read that whole resolution and I didn't think anybody heard me. Okay, fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Bradford.
Sorry about that.
Other questions or comments, Mrs. Frank?
I think this is one of the most important things that the Board of Education does. Passing these budgets and making these decisions and advocating for our schools is one of our primary roles. And I think that we've had long discussions about our budget in every meeting leading up to this, but especially now. And I think that to be able to provide our schools with what they need and our teachers with what they need and our students with what they need is vital to what we all are elected to serve and what we want to do as Board of Education members. And so I think that this is so important and it's hard work. And I just want to say thank you for your staff for doing this and also for communicating it to our parents, because I think our parents want to know what's going on. And with the lack of any major media coverage of this, I think it's important for us to share what's going on in schools, because I don't think that most people know exactly what's going on. So I think this is vital.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Mrs. Bradford.
I echo the sentiments of Crystal. I always feel like we take many leaps forward in education, in funding, and then we just get many steps pulled away from us. It's very frustrating. Like I said, we finally have this 20% fund balance that we've been working, desperately to bring up, and now to find out, in the next 2 years, it's going to go back down to 12%. Quite frankly, is egregious. I think it's frustrating that the state of Michigan does not recognize. I get we have a lot of financial issues in our state right now, but I think our focus really needs to be put towards the education of our students. And it's a very frustrating position to be in, I think, for many school districts. But I agree with Crystal, this is really important work. And we really need to find a solution to how we're going to fund our Michigan schools. And it's hopefully sending this resolution, letting them know how we feel, and letting our community really understand that it's not okay to have a $9 million per year for the next two-year budget shortfall. I think that's frankly terrible. But I think we are working hard at keeping what we want to do best for the kids, and using that fund balance is very important for us right now. We're lucky we have it. And I agree it's not sustainable, but hopefully we'll get some better answers soon from the state as to where our funding's going, and we'll get some better answers.
Thank you, Mrs. Bradford. Other questions, Mrs. Bonifield?
I think Mrs. Bradford alluded it to a little bit, but part of this is not only that the school board and we talk about this, but we need to make sure that this resolution helps to make sure that our community knows and understands that they have the power. They need to get out there and really voice their opinions and send it straight to our legislators and let them know that, we are responsible for the most precious things that we have, which is our children, and their education is not something to toy with. So I just want to express that, we all have the power to voice our opinions. And I think hopefully this resolution will help people to maybe feel comfortable or understand that their voice counts and they need to have their voice out there. And we just need to be really loud and let the state know that we aren't going to allow this to happen to our children anymore, that we need to stand up and let them know that our kids and our education in the state of Michigan is so important.
Thank you, Mrs. Bonifield. Mr. Centers.
Yeah, I can say from my day job in the legislature that we hear from school boards from time to time, we hear from teachers, but we very, very rarely hear from parents and community members. And that can make a big difference in the mood in Lansing and the leadership and priorities. So this, I hope people are hearing this and will take the opportunity to advocate for their students and our community.
Thank you, Mr. Centers. Mrs. Jarvis.
Thank you, President Johnson. I agree with what my colleagues have said. This is an urgent problem. This is not something that we take lightly. And I invite members of the community to investigate how schools are funded. Knowledge is power. And when you have that knowledge, you can approach people in Lansing, you can approach people in Washington, the people who work for us, and you can speak from a point of power, speak your truth, and demand progress, demand change. We've been saying for a long time that the schools are underfunded. What happens when there's a pandemic? What happens when people are stuck at home? How does that affect our economy? When you know the answers to these questions, then you can go to your legislators and demand change. And so I invite you, please do your homework and help us to help our schools and help our children.
Thank you, Mrs. Jarvis. Other questions or comments? Just a reflection that on a more global scale, I think this should teach all of us that we can never let our guard down, that we always have to continue to push forward and never think that we have a cushion, because that cushion can be taken from us very quickly. And I applaud all of us for the work that we've done and the perseverance of moving forward and continuing to push this issue. So much thanks. So if there are no other comments, then we have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Frank, to adopt the resolution for school funding. Mrs. Bonifield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bradford,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mr. Centers,
Yes.
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield says yes, and President Johnson.
Yes, motion carries. Thank you very much. That takes us to item 9B, establishment of dates for organizational meeting and first regular meeting for 2020-2021. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Burton.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District hold its annual organizational meeting at 6:45 p.m. on Monday, July 27th, 2020. Further, that a regular board meeting be held directly following the organizational meeting and commencing at 7:00 p.m.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Frank. Let me just see here. Mrs. Oquist.
Thank you, President Johnson. So we have indeed established our first meeting for the new school year for July 27th. We also updated the calendar for next year, as we had shared with the board this past week based on your feedback. And so you will see the draft of the board calendar on our website, as well as this first meeting. So while we're only required to adopt that first meeting, we do have a schedule of board meetings which have been established and which will be shared with our community and then formally voted upon as part of your first official board meeting of the school year. However, we will be sharing that. It will remain in draft form until the time that you vote on it. But we do have a meeting schedule prepared for next year. We did add some additional study sessions and workshops, which really allow our board and myself and members of our administrative team to continue to really delve deeply into really important items such as those we've discussed this evening. So while at a regular board meeting, we move on a little little faster pace through some of these items, as you always describe, President Johnson, we've discussed those in depth at prior meetings, and those study sessions and committee meetings that you'll see on our agenda truly allow us to do that important work together and allow you to give us direction as to areas where we need to bring back to you some additional research or information to allow you to make your final determinations at the regular board meeting. So that will be available on our district website under the board tab, under board meeting information.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist. Are there any questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Frank, to adopt the establishment of dates for organizational meeting and first regular meeting of 2020-2021. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank,
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford,
Yes.
Mr. Centers,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. That takes us to the point of our meeting, which is 9C, hearing from board members. And as has been customary, I will open it up at this time for any board members who would like to make any comments. Anyone? Seeing nothing. Then I will, this is now the end of the year. The last few months have been very difficult for all of us. And the amount of work that's been put in by all of our staff, from teachers to parapros to custodians to cabinet members, it's just been unbelievable how well and how quickly we have all adapted to these very difficult times. And I don't know of any group that I would more want to be associated with than this group, and everything that they have done and moving forward. And we have to give a nod out to our students too, who have been so respectful in what they've gone through, particularly our seniors. And we just wish them all the best of luck, and we'll just keep our fingers crossed that we're still able to have our commencement on the weekend of August 9th. We'll all keep our fingers crossed that that'll occur. So does anybody else have anything to add?
No.
Seeing none, then we've come to that point of our meeting. Is there any other business to be brought before the meeting tonight? Seeing none, then